welcome to Maine Challenge. In Maine, we have a pretty high voter participation rate, but only in the general election. Last year during our presidential primary, during the general election, 78% of Mainers voted. That was awesome. But in the presidential primary, in our primaries, only 36% of Maine voters voted. Why is that? And how do you actually get to participate in a primary? There's legislation pending now that would change how people can be involved in their primaries. And with us today, we have two phenomenal guests. One is Representative Barb Wood from Portland. Barb is a longtime public servant. She has been mayor, city councilor. She has worked for LL Bean, and now she is a representative from Portland to the Maine State Legislature and is serving on the Veterans and Legal Affairs Committee that is actually looking at this legislation. So Barb, thank you for being with us and welcome. And we also have Caitlin LaCasse, who has run gubernatorial campaigns, is an advocate, and has been working on expanding democracy and voter reform in Maine for many years. So I am thrilled to have both of you with us. The issue of voter participation, voter suppression, voting rights is all over the news nationally and here in Maine. And we have seen bills to both expand voting access and to restrict it. So when we talk about semi-open primaries, Caitlin, can you just tell us what exactly we're talking about?
Absolutely. Thank you, Betsy, and really appreciate the opportunity to be here with you. So a semi-open primary is when an unenrolled voter, and here in Maine, we often call them independents, so they're registered to vote, but are not registered in a political party. Right now, they are not permitted to participate in the primary elections. A semi-open primary would allow those unenrolled independent voters to participate in the primary of their choice. Democrats would not be able to participate in the Republican primary, and vice versa. Republicans would not be permitted to participate in the Democratic primary.
Okay, so I'm an unenrolled voter, independent. I like to call myself an independent, right? I'm not really an independent, but I go in and it's election day, a primary election day, and I say to the clerk, I want to vote in the Democratic primary, or I want to vote in the Republican primary. Now, right now, Barb, right, people can go in and do that, but they have to register as part of the party, right? Okay, so Barb, you had a primary election in this last election, and actually, given the demographics of your district, that was where the race was, right? Was the primary. And so did you have people who were independents or unenrolled people who wanted to vote for you who couldn't or got confused, or how did that play out in your race?
Exactly. I had a three-way Democratic primary, and I spent a lot of time walking in the neighborhood before Election Day, and I would spend time talking with somebody, and they would be very enthusiastic about my campaign and voting for me. And then by the end of the conversation, it would become apparent that they were an unenrolled voter and therefore would not be able to vote for me. So it was at times frustrating for me and frustrating for the person I was talking to, because I thought I had a supporter and they thought they had a good candidate, but they were not able to vote for me in the primary, and therefore the whole race took place in the primary. They weren't able to vote for me at all, because in the general election, there was no opponent. And therefore, a whole segment of the population in my district was not able to participate in the democratic process.
Wow. Right. Well, and I think I read that 70% of elections now are decided in the primaries. Like there's been so much gerrymandering and so much, making sure that districts are heavily Democratic or heavily Republican by the people who draw those districts or redraw those districts, that now that's where most of it takes place. So, right. So it just totally disenfranchises people. So Barb, I want to come back to you. So, so you were sitting on this Veterans and Legal Affairs Committee, and this bill came before you. And I believe that when you first heard about it, you were undecided. You didn't know which way to go. Tell us a little bit about your thought process and what the pros and cons were for you as you started to think about it.
Well, I have to say I've been a lifelong Democrat. I used to go to the polls with my grandmother, who was a ward clerk for the Democrats. But when I first heard about this legislation, I had people should make a decision. They can change their party and enroll and then unenroll again. But as I listened to the testimony, there was a lot of statistics about the number of unenrolled people, whether it's, and I'm sure you can cite all the statistics. I don't have all the numbers off the top of my head, but a lot of younger people, a lot of veterans, I was surprised, who are independent or unenrolled. And so I started looking at the statistics thinking, here's a whole large segment of people that just don't have an opportunity to participate, and they want to, but our system just doesn't allow it.
Yeah, yeah. So Caitlin, what are some of those numbers? What are some of the, and the impact? I know we also just in Maine just instituted automatic voter registration. So talk about what some of those issues are.
Yeah, absolutely. So Representative Wood, you are absolutely right. There are huge constituencies who are essentially left out of the political process because they're unenrolled. So 50% of millennials are unenrolled voters. And this is a generation that is participating in the polls, in the political process at greater numbers than any generation before them. And 49% of veterans are unenrolled. And these are men and women who have helped to protect our democracy abroad. And yet when they return to Maine, at least, they are unable to fully participate. And I think it's worth noting that Maine's an outlier. We're one of only 14 states with completely closed primaries. So other states have figured this out. And it's time that Maine kind of aligns our electoral system with our shared values of civic participation, as Betsy noted, in line with our strong general election turnout. And we do, there is data from around the country that when automatic voter registration is enacted, a significant number of those folks are enrolled as unenrolled voters. So what that means is that if I am not, or if someone's not a registered voter yet, if I go to DMV, I will be automatically registered to vote. What Oregon saw when they instituted automatic voter registration was that 80% of those new voters were unenrolled. So these are folks who 80%, that's a huge number. And when they're talking, hundreds of thousands of new voters. So, there's really going to be over the next few years, likely an even greater percentage of unenrolled voters here in Maine. Right now it stands at 32% of voters are unenrolled.
Right, so almost a third already are unenrolled. And so I think that's really important, is that and the trend certainly is, I think, and maybe Barb, you can talk to this, but it seems to me that as people feel more and more separated from the political parties and feeling more and more like the system is broken, and I don't want to be a Democrat, I don't want to be a Republican, the whole system stinks, but I want to have my voice heard, that this is going to become even more important and not less.
I do think that things are moving in that direction, especially with young people that I talk to. And it just got me to thinking about, why do you have to be enrolled in the party? I certainly am, and many people are, but should you have to be enrolled in order to participate in this democracy, which a lot of people want a say? And I actually been thinking about it. I believe when I first moved to Maine, I enrolled as an unenrolled. And then the first presidential primary came around, and I really wanted to have a part in making a decision as to who was going to be the final candidate on the ballot. And so I did change parties. And after I thought about it, it was the right thing for me. But for many people, it's not. They just want to be able to vote, and they don't want to have to participate in a party.
Right. And I think a lot of times what I hear from people, and what I heard in my campaign certainly, was that one of the reasons they didn't want to participate in a party is because the minute they did, then all they got was these endless phone calls and fundraising solicitations. And, it wasn't about the values of either party. It was just sort of how our system works. But also, I also think it's confusing for people, and I want Caitlin to talk about this, because I know that the town clerks weighed in a little bit. But a lot of people, right, so it's primary time, and when there's a contested primary presidential, or even a US Senate race, let's say, and people see the signs up and they're all excited, and they go to vote, and often they wait in line for some amount of time. I've heard people say, well, you can just enroll in the party and then unenroll. Well, so then they get to the register, to sign in. Then they're told they have to register. And then what happens, Caitlin? Why were the town clerks weighing in?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Great question. The Town Clerks Association, Town City Clerks Association did submit testimony. It was neither for nor against, but they made it clear that there is a procedural way where an unenrolled voter could go, as you mentioned, Betsy, on election day and enroll in a party if they were willing to do so. But especially in this last presidential primary, it became very burdensome, both for the voters themselves, but also for the election workers, because there was such interest in voting in the primary. So the way I understood it from hearing their testimony was, an unenrolled voter, maybe even thought that they were enrolled in a party, showed up, was in the wrong line, was told, no, you can't participate, you can't vote, you have to go to that line to register in a party. They would go over there and then they have to come back. And so there was multiple steps, which can become a barrier for a lot of people, especially if you have a tight time frame in which to vote. I mean, if I have, a 30-minute lunch break and I'm trying to vote, if I have to go to multiple lines, that might in fact be a barrier for me to end up voting. And it takes more paperwork and more confusion that the election workers are having to handle on an already very busy day with a lot of moving pieces. So.
Well, and I think the other piece is, and I heard this so many times on election day, is they also have to have 2 forms of ID with them if they're going to register in a new, if they're going to re-register in a party. So people come and they don't have, they don't come with, thank God we don't have voter ID in the state. So they don't come with 2 forms of ID or a letter that shows where they live. And so then they have to go back home and get that stuff and then wait in line. So it's not just multiple lines, but they have to wait in line another time. So it was just to me, it's an interesting piece, administrative piece of this that would actually make it easier for the people who are trying to run our elections. So let's talk for a minute about the opposition. And Barb, and you said that you had this feeling in the beginning. I think actually, honestly, I did too, which is, if you want to be part of, if you want to be part of who the Democrats are going to put forward, then you need to become a Democrat, or vice versa, Republicans. And someone even said to me, well, if I want to elect the deacon in my church, I'm not going to allow the person from the synagogue down the street to elect my deacon in my church. Can you talk a little bit about sort of how that argument falls flat in democracy, or if it does?
Well, I'm not sure if I followed your example, but the example that I was thinking of was that some people were saying, well, you could strategize to get somebody on the ballot that you think is the worst candidate to run against your candidate. And I think that we had some conversation at the time about how that really doesn't play out in real life. But people like to use that as an argument. I don't know if you want to speak to that anymore, Betsy.
Yeah. Or Caitlin, do you want to say anything about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is one concern we've heard, and we recognize that people, legitimately hold that concern. And I'd like to say, the bill sponsor, Senator Chloe Maxim, actually amended the bill to make it so that you couldn't, if you are a Democrat, you can't show up day of and unenroll and then vote in the Republican primary. So there's now a 15-day waiting period, which is in line with the same amount of time you would have to wait to change parties and participate in their primary. So I think hopefully that will alleviate some of the concern. Also, 2 other important points is I think all of us have worked in politics and on campaigns, and it's really hard it's challenging to get the people who support your candidate to show up at the polls and vote for them. And I think that this idea that there could be some organized effort to get enough people who oppose a candidate to show up and vote for them, I can't even imagine how that practically would work. I'm exhausted thinking about it.
It makes me laugh because I think, okay, so just and we've all run campaigns and been in campaigns. So what we're talking about is someone from, let's say, the Democratic Party who wants the worst Republican candidate to win. So now the Democratic person is going to have to convince an unenrolled person who's not part of their party to go vote in a Republican primary for a candidate that they don't want. so that, you know, I mean, it's when the legislators gave me this argument, and I was like, have you ever actually run an election? Because there might be 2 people in the world who would do that, but the thought that you're going to en masse get people to do this is just, it's impossible. It's absurd. So yeah. So you had another point, Caitlin. I didn't mean to interrupt.
Well, to piggyback on that, I think it's important to note and remind everybody that, again, other states have semi-open primaries and open primaries, and this has not been an issue in those states. So you know, we're actually not cutting edge here in trying to enact this reform, which is great because we can see that it has worked as intended in other states, and none of these shenanigans have happened. And then lastly, I wanted to point out that you know, primary elections, and a lot of people don't realize this, are paid for with taxpayer dollars. The parties don't pay for their elections. So that's where, you know, when we hear those arguments, oh, well, a Red Sox, coach shouldn't be setting the Yankees lineup or whatever. But what I think about it is, well, the Red Sox aren't paying for the Yankees either. And I think that is really resonates with a lot of folks when you realize that 32% of Maine voters are paying for elections in which they are currently prohibited from participating. And that is just, I think for a lot of us, just feels fundamentally unfair and undemocratic.
Yeah. Let's talk for a minute about how this might impact elections. So Barb, when you're, we target voters, we look at voting lists and all that kind of stuff. So if now we have unenrolled people who can vote, how does that change what you do as a candidate or how you might approach an election?
Well, actually, I'll answer that, but I want to go back to a comment that one of you made about the voter is sometimes and frequently confused about how they're enrolled. Somebody that I know personally, I called to talk to about my campaign, and he said, "I'm sorry, Barb, I'm unenrolled. I can't vote for you." And I said, "Well, I have my list, my voter list, and it says on here that you're registered as a Democrat. So yes, you can vote for me." And he was adamant that he was unenrolled. And I kept trying to talk him through, I have an up-to-date, accurate list, and you are registered as a Democrat, and you can vote for me. Because he didn't want to go through the effort of changing. It turned out, the more he thought about it, many years ago, he had changed to unenrolled. And at some point, there was somebody that he wanted to support in a primary, and he changed to a Democrat, thought he had changed back, but there's a 45-day waiting period or something like that before you can change back. So you have to remember to do that. And he hadn't. Yeah. So consequently, I did get one vote from him. But as far as I said, as I walked the neighborhood, I actually didn't do any door knocking because of COVID, but lots of folks were outside. I walked the neighborhood a lot, talked to lots of folks outside. But after the conversation and I would get their name, I would go back to my voter roll and try to then target them with a follow-up postcard or phone call or whatever. If they were unenrolled, I usually didn't because I had to move on. But in this case, if we had a semi-open primaries, I would have a bigger list and I would be able to talk with more people and involve more people in my campaign.
Someone has said, I've heard people argue that this will make for stronger candidates on both sides because they have to appeal from the very beginning to a broader swath of people. And, and let's be real, in the unenrolled population in Maine, we have unenrolled people who are on the QAnon end of the spectrum, and we have unenrolled people who are on the Green Party, other end. So, and as a candidate, when you see that U next to their name or independent next to their name, you don't know. So you don't know whether, if you've already, let's say you've already taken care of all your Democrats, you don't know if you're reaching out to the most conservative people who, so do you think that's accurate?
Well, it's so interesting you brought that up because yesterday in the State House, I started talking to two colleagues, fellow legislators about this issue. And both of them said, oh, you got to be aware of this because, most of the independents are very conservative, and as Democrats, we don't want to bring more conservative people in. And I said, well, in my district, number one, I don't think that's true. I think it's the opposite in my district. So I think that people try to make assumptions about what's going on out there. And to your point, we need to appeal to people. And I might not agree 100% with somebody on all issues, but my job is, as a candidate, is to try to find those issues where we can find common ground. And it's going to make me work a little bit harder and listen a little bit more and think a little bit more about ideas that I have that maybe I need, just like with semi-open primaries. As I said in the beginning, I was like, no, I don't think so. But as I thought about it, listened to people, looked at data, I came to change my mind. And I feel pretty strongly about it now. I do hope, before we run out of time, that we could just explain the difference quickly between semi-open and open, because that was some confusion on the committee.
Okay. Great. No, that's awesome. So Caitlin, can you just do the difference between open primaries and semi-open?
Absolutely. So we've already explained semi-open primaries when an unenrolled voter can participate in the primary of their choice, but a Democrat wouldn't be able to participate in a Republican primary or vice versa. There's several other types of primaries. One would be a Republican could also cross over and vote in the Democratic primary, for example, or vice versa. And then you also see like a top 4 or a top 2, where you might have a primary where the end result is that there's 2 people from the same party who are were the general election candidates. And so there's a variety of different ways to do this. And again, here in Maine, we're just looking at the semi-open primary to allow those unenrolled voters who are our neighbors and our friends and who are already very engaged, as we know from our general election turnout, to participate in those primary elections. And I just want to say one more point also to us, we don't really know where unenrolled voters fall on the political spectrum, and it could be anywhere. But this would give candidates another tool in their toolbox where it will be tracked which party primary that the voters participate in. And that could be really helpful data as candidates are moving from the primary to the general, and then the following primary, they'll know who they should be talking to earlier on. So you might, if an unenrolled candidate has never voted in the Democratic primary, maybe you won't prioritize talking to them, or maybe you will, because you need to expand your that base of vote. So I think it just gives another data point that will be helpful for candidates moving forward as well.
So both candidates and parties, after the first election anyway, would then have an opportunity to say, oh, where in the spectrum are these folks falling? And so then I can reach out to the, depending on that can help determine where I'm going to spend my time and my resources in terms of who I'm going to talk to. So let's talk about where this is in the legislature. So Barb, this was heard before your committee, and then you voted it out and came out with the majority report, yeah?
Yes, I majority ought to pass report. Okay. It's not on today's calendar, so I'm assuming we have another week and a half after today. It will be on the calendar. I'm guessing next week, not the following.
And just for a second, Caitlin, talk a little bit about how this fits into what's happening nationally. I mean, nationally, we're seeing so much effort to restrict voting, and we just saw the Texas legislature, the Democrats just walked out to prevent some really draconian restrictions on voting. And in Maine, I think we can be really proud of the fact that we actually we have ranked choice voting, we have clean elections, we have, we work, I think, pretty hard to expand. And I think it's reflected in the number of people that actually vote in our general election. But where does this fit in nationally, and how do you see this in terms of voter participation and voter expansion in general?
Yeah, well, I think, you said most of what needs to be said, Betsy, but I think in a political landscape where nationally in legislative chambers around the country, there are pockets of legislators who are working very hard to restrict voting rights. And here, Maine has an opportunity to proactively expand them. And I think that's a really exciting opportunity to really bring our electoral process in line with what we recognize as our shared values of voter participation. I just think it is a very important and exciting step to be moving in the right direction, especially where, in contrast with so many legislatures that are not moving in this direction. They're kind of going the opposite way. So,
yeah. So Barb, for you, I think, and we just have a minute or two left, but does this feel good? This must feel good to be able to sort of say to 32% of Maine voters, come on in.
Yeah.
Yes, it does. It's the direction we need to go, and I just hope we can vote it through on the floor.
Yeah, well, that's great. And so if you're watching, this is LD 231 is the number of the bill. If you're watching, you can take a look at it next week. It has to go through the legislature and then get signed by the governor. But I think that this is really a great bellwether about voter participation and about saying, and someone asked me when we were preparing for the show, well, is this going to help Democrats or is this going to help Republicans? And I said, it's going to help the people who use it and organize. I mean, it could help anybody. You're using it as a tool to organize, and most importantly, as a tool to reach out more. We need more conversation between people and politicians. Not less. We need more reasons for us to interact, more reasons for us to be able to have conversations, so that when you get to the position that you're in, Barb, where you're representing people, you are really representing the broadest swath of people that we can have. And that's only good for democracy. So thank you both so much for the work that you're doing, for being with us today. And to the viewers of Maine Challenge, thank you for tuning in. Tune in again next week. We're going to be talking about the Racial Bias Commission and making sure that we have equity in this state. And we are so thrilled to have both of you here. Thanks for the work that you're doing. And whatever happens, let's challenge ourselves to have the best democracy we can. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.